The janitor found a list in the trash. My name was on it. So were 11 others. Mr. Okonkwo knocked on my homeroom door at 7:47 in the morning, still wearing his blue maintenance uniform with the frayed collar he'd been meaning to replace since September. His hands were shaking when he handed the paper to Mrs. Albright, and I watched his eyes scan the room until they landed on me in the third row by the window. Something in his face made my stomach drop before I even knew why. Mrs. Albright unfolded the paper, read it silently, and the color drained from her cheeks so fast I thought she might pass out. She looked up at me, then back at the paper, then walked out into the hallway without saying a word to anyone. The whole class went silent, that heavy kind of quiet where you can hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I sat there with my pen still in my hand from copying the homework assignment, watching through the narrow window in the door as Mrs. Albright made a phone call, her free hand pressed against her mouth. 3 minutes later, Principal Vasquez came around the corner at a jog, which I'd never seen him do in 4 years at this school. He read the paper, said something sharp to Mrs. Albright, and then both of them looked through the window directly at me. That's when I knew whatever was on that paper had my name on it. They pulled me out of class without explaining anything, just told me to bring my backpack and follow them to the main office. The walk down the hallway felt endless, my sneakers squeaking against the tile while my mind raced through everything I'd done in the past week, trying to figure out what kind of trouble I was in. I hadn't done anything wrong that I could remember. My grades were decent. I hadn't been in any fights. I'd stopped skipping fourth period after my mom threatened to take my car keys. Principal Vasquez led me into the conference room instead of his office, the one they used for serious meetings with lawyers and parents and people from the district. The janitor was already there, sitting in a chair against the wall and looking at his hands. So was Officer Garland, the school resource officer who usually spent his days breaking up vaping circles in the bathroom and flirting with the lunch ladies. He wasn't smiling now. He was standing with his arms crossed, his hand resting near his radio like he expected to need it. Principal Vasquez closed the door behind us, and the click of the latch sounded way too loud. He told me to sit down, and I did, dropping into the chair across from his desk while my heart hammered against my ribs. Then he slid that piece of paper across the table toward me and said, "Can you explain this?" I picked it up and my whole world tilted sideways. It was a list. 12 names written in blue ink on a torn piece of notebook paper, numbered 1 through 12. My name was 6th, Darren Whitfield. I recognized every single name on that list. We were all seniors. We were all on the varsity basketball team together, or had been until Coach Reeves cut half the squad at tryouts last month. I read through the names twice, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Jalen Torres, Kwame Asante, Miles Pemberton, Nico Dela Cruz, Isaiah Fontaine, Darren Whitfield, Terrence Mack, Dion Rivers, Andre Baptiste, Omar Khalil, Benjin Guin, Tobias Sterling. 12 of us, all written out in someone's handwriting I didn't recognize. Next to each name was a single word or short phrase. Next to Jalen's name, traitor. Next to Kwame's, fake friend. Next to mine, deserves it. At the bottom of the page, below the last name, someone had written in all capital letters, "They all have to pay. Friday." I looked up at Principal Vasquez and the words came out before I could stop them. I asked him what this was, what it meant, where it came from. My voice cracked on the last question. Officer Garland stepped forward and asked me if I wrote that list. I told him no, absolutely not. I'd never seen this paper before in my life. Mr. Okonkwo finally spoke up from his chair against the wall. He said he found it in the trash can outside the weight room this morning, crumpled up near the bottom under some protein bar wrappers and empty Gatorade bottles. He almost threw it away with everything else, but something made him look closer. The next 4 hours were the longest of my life. They brought in my parents, who arrived looking terrified and confused after getting pulled out of work with no explanation beyond, "There's been an incident." They brought in the other 11 kids on the list, one by one, along with their families. Some of them I'd known since elementary school. Jalen and I used to ride bikes together before his family moved across town. Kwame was my lab partner in chemistry last year. We'd all played basketball together since freshman year, back when Coach Reeves still treated us like human beings instead of statistics on a clipboard. The police arrived around 10:30, not just Officer Garland, but real detectives in plain clothes with badges clipped to their belts. They set up in the guidance counselor's office and started calling us in for interviews one at a time. When it was my turn, I sat across from a woman named Detective Navarro, who had sharp eyes and a tablet where she took notes. She asked me the same questions a dozen different ways. Did I write the list? Did I know who wrote the list? Had I heard anyone talk about hurting the people on the list? Did I know what was supposed to happen Friday? I answered honestly every time. No, 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 and no. She showed me the list again and asked if I recognized the handwriting. I stared at those letters until they blurred, trying to find something familiar in the loops and slants. I told her it didn't match anyone I knew, but that didn't mean much. I wasn't exactly a handwriting expert. She wrote something in her tablet and told me I could go back to the conference room. By lunchtime, the whole school knew something was happening. The hallways were buzzing with rumors that got wilder with each retelling. Someone said there was a bomb threat. Someone else said a kid brought a gun. Another person swore they'd seen FBI agents in the parking lot. The 12 of us were kept isolated in the conference room, our phones confiscated, unable to call anyone or check what people were saying about us online. Jalen sat next to me picking at his thumbnail until it bled. Kwame kept bouncing his knees so hard the table vibrated. Nobody talked much, but we all kept looking at each other with the same question in our eyes. Who did this? And why us? Around 1 p.m., Principal Vasquez came back with an update that made everything worse. He said the handwriting on the list had been analyzed by someone in the district, and it didn't match any student currently enrolled. The paper itself was generic notebook paper sold at every drugstore and supermarket in the state. There were no fingerprints on it except Mr. Okonkwo's from when he picked it up. In other words, they had no idea who wrote it, which meant they had no idea if the threat was real. Principal Vasquez looked at us with something that might have been pity or might have been fear. He said the school would be closed Friday as a precaution. He said we were free to go home, but police would be increasing patrols in all our neighborhoods. He said to be careful. Then he left us there in that conference room staring at each other. 12 targets with no idea who was aiming at us. My mom drove me home in silence, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She'd been crying but trying to hide it, dabbing at her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. My dad followed behind us in his own car because they'd come separately from work. When we got home, my little sister Aaliyah was already there, sent home early from middle school because the district decided to close all the buildings until Monday. She ran to me when I walked through the door and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. She was only 12, but she understood enough to be scared. My mom made everyone sit in the living room while she called my grandparents and my aunt in Detroit and my uncle in Atlanta, spreading the news through the family like wildfire. I could hear her voice shaking through the wall. My dad sat across from me in his recliner with his hands folded under his chin, studying my face like he was looking for something. He asked me if I had any idea who could have done this, any enemies I hadn't told him about, anyone who might want to hurt me. I thought about it seriously, running through every interaction I'd had in the past year. I'd had arguments, sure. Disagreements with teammates about plays and positions, some tension with Terrence over a girl we'd both liked sophomore year, but nothing that seemed like it would lead to someone making a list. Nothing that felt like kill list level hatred. I told my dad I couldn't think of anyone. He nodded slowly and didn't say anything else, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. The local news picked up the story by 5 p.m. Some reporter was standing in front of our school with a serious expression, talking about a credible threat and 12 students, and Friday being a day of concern. She didn't say our names on air, but that didn't matter. By 6, someone had posted the list online. An image of the actual paper Mr. Okonkwo found, presumably photographed by someone in the office before it was taken as evidence. Within an hour, my phone was exploding with texts and calls and DMs from people I hadn't talked to in years. Some of them were worried about me. Some of them wanted gossip. Some of them were straight up accusing me of writing the list myself as some kind of sick joke. I scrolled through the messages feeling like I was drowning. One text stood out from the rest. It was from Jalen, sent at 6:47 p.m. Check the basketball group chat. Something's wrong. I opened the chat that all the varsity players used for coordinating rides and trash talking during games. There were 247 unread messages. The most recent ones were screenshots of social media posts, people from our school speculating about who wrote the list. And the most popular theory, repeated over and over in different variations, was that one of us 12 had written it ourselves, that this was some elaborate prank or attention grab, that we were all in on it together. I felt sick reading the accusations, watching people I thought were friends turn on us without any evidence at all. The police called my parents that night around 9. Detective Navarro wanted to know if I had any connection to a student named Graham Dorsey. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Graham used to be on the basketball team with us. He'd been a starter his freshman and sophomore years, one of the best point guards we'd ever had. But something changed junior year. He got quieter, missed practices, showed up to games looking like he hadn't slept in days. Coach Reeves rode him harder than anyone, called him out in front of the whole team, made him run suicides until he threw up. One day, Graham just stopped coming. Nobody knew exactly why he left the team, just that Coach Reeves had a closed-door meeting with him and his parents, and after that, Graham was done. He transferred to a different school a few months later. I hadn't seen him since. I told Detective Navarro all of this, my voice getting tighter with each sentence. She asked if Graham had ever threatened any of us directly. I said not that I remembered, but we'd all kind of stopped talking to him after he quit. It was easier that way. We didn't have to feel guilty about not standing up for him when Coach Reeves was tearing him down. We could just pretend he never existed. Detective Navarro thanked me for the information and hung up. I sat on my bed in the dark, holding my phone, the full weight of it finally sinking in. This might be about Graham, and if it was, then we weren't random targets. We were specifically chosen. Every name on that list had been on the team when Graham was. Every single one of us had watched Coach Reeves break him down and done nothing to stop it. I called Jalen at midnight when I couldn't sleep. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he couldn't sleep either. I asked him if he remembered what happened with Graham. Really remembered, and he was quiet for a long time before answering. He said he remembered everything. The way Coach Reeves would scream at Graham during practice, calling him weak and worthless and a waste of a scholarship. The way he'd make Graham run extra drills while the rest of us went to the locker room. The way we'd hear him crying in the shower afterward and pretend we didn't notice. Jalen's voice was raw when he told me he used to have nightmares about it. About the look on Graham's face when Coach would get in his space, nose to nose, screaming so loud you could see the spit flying. But we'd all been too scared to say anything. Too focused on making varsity ourselves, on not becoming the next target. So we let it happen. We stood there and watched a kid get destroyed and did absolutely nothing. Jalen asked me if I thought this was karma, if Graham was coming back to make us pay for being cowards. I didn't have an answer for him. I just lay there in the dark, listening to him breathe, both of us trapped in memories we'd spent 2 years trying to forget. Thursday morning, the police announced they'd located Graham Dorsey. He was living with his grandmother about 40 miles away, attending a new school where nobody knew his history. Detectives drove out to interview him and came back with news that somehow made everything more confusing. Graham had an alibi for the entire week. He was on a school trip to Washington, D.C. with his AP government class, surrounded by 30 witnesses and 2 teachers at all times. He'd been photographed at the Lincoln Memorial on the same morning Mr. Okonkwo found the list. There was no way he could have planted it. But when the detectives showed Graham a copy of the list, his reaction told them everything. He recognized every name. He knew exactly who we were and what we'd done. And when they asked him directly if he'd threatened us, Graham broke down crying. He said he'd thought about it. He'd fantasized about making us suffer the way he'd suffered. He'd written lists just like that one in his journal, hundreds of them over the years, each name a wound that never healed, but he'd never shown them to anyone. He'd never planned to actually do anything. He said his therapist had helped him work through the anger, that he was finally in a place where he could move forward. The detectives believed him. His grandmother backed up his story about the journal, said she'd found pages like that and it had scared her enough to get him professional help. The handwriting analysis came back. Graham's handwriting didn't match the list. Someone else had written it. Someone who knew about Graham's pain and was using it as a template. The investigation shifted. Instead of focusing on who might want to hurt us, the detectives started looking at who knew about Graham's story. Who knew exactly which players were on the team during his breakdown? Who knew enough details to write those specific words next to our names? Traitor. Fake friend. Deserves it. Those weren't random accusations. They were specific. Personal. Like whoever wrote the list knew exactly what each of us had done or failed to do while Graham was falling apart. I started making my own list of people who might have that information. Other players who got cut and might hold grudges. Kids who'd been close to Graham before he transferred. Teachers who'd witnessed the abuse in the gym. And then my mind went somewhere I didn't want it to go. Coach Reeves himself. He'd been the one behind closed doors with Graham. He'd been the one who knew every detail of what happened. He'd been the one who pushed hardest to cover it up afterward, telling us to keep our mouths shut about team business or lose our spots on the roster. I'd always assumed he was protecting himself, protecting the program. But what if there was more to it? What if someone had finally decided to expose what he'd done? I went to the school that afternoon even though it was closed. The parking lot was empty except for a few faculty cars and a police cruiser doing a slow loop around the building. I walked around back to the weight room entrance, the same door where Mr. Okonkwo had found the trash can with the list. The door was locked. Crime scene tape stretched across the handle, but I could see through the narrow window beside it. The weight room looked the same as always. Benches and racks and the motivational posters Coach Reeves had hung on every wall. Winners never quit. Pain is weakness leaving the body. Champions are made when no one is watching. I used to believe those words. I used to think Coach Reeves was teaching us discipline, toughness, what it meant to be a man. Now I looked at those posters and saw them for what they were. Manipulation. A way to make abuse seem like instruction. A system designed to break anyone who couldn't keep up while the rest of us stayed silent to protect ourselves. I was still standing there when a voice behind me made me jump. It was Mr. Okonkwo, still in his maintenance uniform, a ring of keys in his hand. He asked what I was doing there, and I didn't have a good answer. He studied my face for a long moment, then said something that changed everything. He told me I wasn't the first person to come looking at that door today. Mr. Okonkwo led me to the small office he used as a break room near the boiler. The space was cramped, just a desk and a folding chair and a microwave that looked older than I was. He sat me down and told me he'd been thinking about that list ever since he found it. Something about it bothered him beyond the obvious threat. He pulled a small notebook from his desk drawer and flipped to a page covered in his own handwriting. He'd made notes about everything. The exact location of the trash can, the other items he'd found alongside the list, the timestamps from his morning rounds. He showed me a detail that the police had apparently overlooked. The trash can outside the weight room was emptied every afternoon at 4:30. He'd done it himself the day before. That meant the list had been placed there sometime between 4:30 p.m. and 7:15 a.m. when he found it. The weight room was locked overnight. Only 3 people had keys: him, Principal Vasquez, and Coach Reeves. I stared at those 3 names in his notebook and felt the pieces clicking together in my head. I asked Mr. Okonkwo why he was telling me this, why he wasn't taking it to the police. He gave me a look that was hard to read, something between sadness and determination. He said he'd worked at this school for 23 years. He'd watched a lot of coaches come and go. He'd seen patterns that nobody else wanted to acknowledge. And he'd learned the hard way that when powerful people were involved, the truth had a way of getting buried. I went home and spent the rest of Thursday digging through everything I could find about Coach Reeves online. His LinkedIn profile said he'd coached at 3 other schools before coming to ours, all in different states. His record was impressive on paper. Winning seasons, conference championships, a few players who'd gone on to college ball. But when I searched the names of those schools along with controversy and investigation, I started finding shadows. A forum post from 7 years ago about a player at his first school who'd had a mental breakdown mid-season. A news article from his second school about hazing allegations that were thoroughly investigated and resulted in no disciplinary action. A lawsuit filed at his third school that was settled out of court with terms that were never disclosed. The pattern was there if you knew how to look for it. Coach Reeves moved from school to school, leaving damage in his wake, protected by winning records and administrations that didn't want scandals. Graham wasn't his first victim. Graham might not even be his worst. I screenshotted everything and sent it to Jalen with a simple message. We need to talk. We met up at a park about a mile from school, the 11 of us who were physically able to get there on short notice. Isaiah was still too scared to leave his house, so we added him to a video call. We sat in a circle on the grass like we were back in Pee Wee football, except instead of discussing plays, we were discussing whether our coach might be trying to kill us. I laid out everything I'd found, passing my phone around so everyone could see the screenshots. The room, or in this case the open air, went quiet as they read. Kwame spoke first. He said he'd heard rumors about Coach Reeves' last school, something about a kid who tried to hurt himself after getting cut from the team. Terrence mentioned that his older cousin had played for Reeves 5 years ago and still refused to talk about the experience. One by one, the stories came out. Things we'd noticed but never discussed. The way Coach would single out certain players for psychological warfare while protecting others. The threats he'd make about ruining futures if anyone talked to parents or administrators. The climate of fear that kept us all in line. But none of us could figure out why Coach Reeves would write a list threatening his own players. What would he gain from scaring us? Unless he wasn't the one who wrote it. Unless someone else was trying to expose him. The answer came from the most unexpected source. Omar, who barely ever spoke during team meetings, who'd spent most of his senior year fading into the background after Coach Reeves told him he'd never amount to anything. Omar pulled out his phone and showed us a text thread. It was from an anonymous number, no name attached. The messages had started 2 weeks ago. At first they were vague. You know what happened to Graham. You could have stopped it. Silence makes you complicit. Omar had ignored them. Figured it was just someone messing with him. But then they got more specific. Details about practices he'd forgotten. Things Coach Reeves had said that nobody outside the team should have known. And 3 days ago, a message that made his blood run cold. Friday will be a reckoning. Make sure you're somewhere safe. Omar had been too scared to tell anyone. He'd convinced himself it was a prank, a test, anything other than what it clearly was. A warning. Someone had been watching us. Someone knew everything about what happened to Graham and what Coach Reeves did to him. And that someone was planning to make Friday a day none of us would forget. Except now, because of Mr. Okonkwo finding that list, the whole plan had been exposed early. Friday's reckoning had been canceled before it could happen. But whoever was behind this was still out there. Still angry. Still waiting. I showed the texts to Detective Navarro that evening. She was skeptical at first, asking why Omar hadn't come forward immediately. I defended him as best I could, explaining the culture of silence Coach Reeves had created, how we'd all been trained to keep our mouths shut about anything that might make the program look bad. She took Omar's phone as evidence and said they'd try to trace the anonymous number. Before she left, I asked her directly if Coach Reeves was a suspect. She gave me a look that told me everything and nothing at the same time. She said everyone with access to that weight room was being investigated. She said she couldn't discuss details of an active case. But she also said something that stuck with me. She told me to keep my distance from Coach Reeves until the investigation was complete. Not because she had proof of anything, just as a precaution. The way she said precaution made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She knew something she wasn't telling me. Something that made her warn a 17-year-old to stay away from his own coach. Friday came and went without incident. The school stayed closed. Police patrolled every street within a mile radius. News vans circled the neighborhood like vultures waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The 12 of us hunkered down in our houses, checking in with each other through text chains that never stopped moving. We shared rumors and theories and screenshots of what people were saying online. Some kids from school were calling us liars, saying we made the whole thing up for attention. Others were treating us like heroes who'd survived a near-miss tragedy. I didn't feel like either one. I just felt tired and scared and guilty about things I'd done years ago that were somehow coming back to haunt me. Saturday morning, my dad knocked on my bedroom door with news that changed everything. The police had made an arrest. They'd traced the anonymous texts Omar received to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station 2 towns over. Security footage from the store showed the buyer, a woman in her late 40s with blonde hair and familiar features. Detective Navarro had identified her almost immediately. Her name was Patricia Dorsey, Graham's mother. Patricia Dorsey broke down in custody within 2 hours. She confessed to writing the list, sending the threatening texts, and planting the note in the trash can outside the weight room. She'd used an old key she'd copied back when Graham was on the team, back when she'd pick him up from practice and watch helplessly as her son came out looking more broken every day. She told the detectives everything, how she'd watched her baby boy transform from a bright, confident kid into a shell of himself because of what Coach Reeves did, how she'd tried to complain to the school and been dismissed as an overprotective parent, how she'd gone to the athletic director and been told Graham just couldn't handle the pressure, how she'd begged Principal Vasquez to intervene and been promised an investigation that never happened. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. And when Graham finally left the team and transferred schools, everyone acted like the problem had solved itself, but the problem hadn't been solved. It had just been hidden. Graham was still in therapy 3 years later, still having nightmares about what Coach Reeves did to him, still flinching when men raised their voices, still struggling to trust anyone in authority. Patricia watched her son suffer day after day while everyone who could have helped him moved on with their lives. And something inside her snapped. She wanted us to feel what Graham felt, that fear of not knowing when the next attack would come, That paranoia about who you could trust. That sense of being hunted by forces you couldn't see or stop. She didn't actually plan to hurt anyone. The list was meant to force an investigation, to bring attention to what Coach Reeves had done, to finally make someone listen to what she'd been screaming about for 3 years. She thought if the police got involved, if reporters started asking questions, the truth about Coach Reeves would finally come out. She was right about that, at least. The media coverage of the list had already generated enough interest that journalists were digging into Coach Reeves's background. Within 2 days of Patricia's arrest, 3 other families had come forward with similar stories from his previous schools. Players who'd been psychologically abused, parents who'd been intimidated into silence, administrators who'd chosen to protect their winning programs over their students' well-being. The pattern was undeniable. Coach Reeves had been doing this for over a decade, moving from school to school whenever things got too hot, leaving a trail of damaged kids behind him. And nobody had stopped him because nobody wanted to look too closely at a coach who won games. The school board held an emergency meeting that Monday night. The conference room was packed, standing room only, with parents and students and reporters crowding every available space. Principal Vasquez sat at the front table looking like he'd aged 10 years in 1 week. Coach Reeves was notably absent. Someone said he'd lawyered up and was refusing to comment on the allegations. Someone else said he'd already fled the state. The meeting was supposed to be about safety protocols and the decision to cancel Friday classes, but it quickly became something else. One by one, parents stood up and demanded answers. Why had complaints about Coach Reeves been ignored? Why had Graham Dorsey been allowed to transfer without anyone investigating what happened to him? Why had 12 students spent a week in fear because the school failed to address a known problem? The board members shuffled papers and gave non-answers about ongoing investigations and privacy concerns. They tried to move to the next agenda item, but then something happened that nobody expected. A kid stood up in the back of the room. He looked maybe 15, thin and nervous, wearing a hoodie with the sleeves pulled over his hands. He said his name was Damien, and he was on the JV basketball team. He said Coach Reeves had been doing the same thing to him that he'd done to Graham. The same screaming, the same isolation, the same psychological warfare. He said he tried to tell the assistant coach, but the assistant coach said that's just how Reeves operates. He tried to tell his parents, but they said he needed to toughen up. He'd been thinking about quitting, about transferring, about worse things he didn't want to say out loud. The room went completely silent. Damien's voice was shaking, but he kept talking. He said he wasn't the only one. There were 4 other JV players going through the same thing right now. 4 more kids getting broken down while the adults looked the other way. The dam broke after Damien spoke. Other players stood up, current and former, describing their experiences with Coach Reeves in detail that made some parents physically recoil. The manipulation tactics, the verbal abuse disguised as motivation, the threats about scholarships and futures, and what would happen if anyone talked. By the end of the meeting, the school board had no choice but to announce Coach Reeves was being placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough for years of damage done, but it was a start. I found Damien in the parking lot afterward. He was sitting on the curb alone, staring at his phone with red-rimmed eyes. I sat down next to him and didn't say anything for a while. Finally, he looked up and asked if it was true, if I was one of the kids on the list. I said yes. He asked if I'd ever tried to stop what was happening to Graham. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell him I'd done everything I could, that I'd been helpless against a powerful coach. But looking at this kid who'd just risked everything to tell his truth, I couldn't pretend anymore. I told him no. I told him we all just watched it happen and did nothing. I told him that was why the list existed in the first place. Because Patricia Dorsey knew we were guilty too. The investigation into Coach Reeves expanded over the following weeks. The athletic director resigned. Principal Vasquez was placed on administrative leave alongside the coach he'd protected for years. 2 assistant coaches were terminated for failing to report abuse they'd witnessed firsthand. The school board hired an outside firm to conduct a comprehensive review of their athletics programs, interviewing over 100 current and former students about their experiences. The report, when it finally came out, was devastating. It documented a culture of fear and silence that extended far beyond basketball. Coaches in multiple sports had used similar tactics. Administrators had consistently prioritized winning records over student welfare. Complaints had been systematically buried or ignored. The recommendations filled 20 pages. Mandatory training for coaches, anonymous reporting systems for students, independent oversight of all athletic programs, and a complete overhaul of how the school handled allegations of abuse. Patricia Dorsey was charged with making terroristic threats and reckless endangerment. Her lawyer argued that she'd never intended to actually harm anyone, that her actions were a desperate attempt to protect children after the system had failed her son. The judge agreed to reduce the charges in exchange for a guilty plea to criminal mischief and harassment. She received 2 years of probation and mandatory counseling. At her sentencing hearing, she stood before the court and apologized for scaring us. But she also said she wasn't sorry for finally making people listen. I went to see Graham about a month after everything settled down. It took some convincing to get his grandmother to agree to the visit, and even more convincing to get Graham to come downstairs when I arrived. We sat on opposite ends of his grandmother's living room, both of us awkward and unsure of what to say. He looked different than I remembered, thinner, quieter, with a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there when we were freshmen together. I told him I was sorry, not just for what happened in the last few weeks, but for everything. For watching Coach Reeves tear him apart and doing nothing. For being too afraid of losing my own spot to stand up for a teammate. For pretending he didn't exist after he left. For all of it. Graham listened without expression. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that hit me harder than anything else had in this whole nightmare. He said he used to imagine scenarios like this: me coming to apologize, the school finally paying attention, Coach Reeves getting fired. He'd dreamed about it constantly during his darkest days, but now that it was actually happening, he didn't feel the satisfaction he'd expected. He just felt tired of being angry, tired of being defined by what one person did to him, tired of having to relive it over and over every time someone wanted to apologize for their part in his trauma. He said he forgave me, not because I deserved it, but because carrying that anger was exhausting and he wanted to let it go. But he also said he never wanted to see me again. The 12 of us on the list met up one more time at the end of the school year. We sat in a circle at the same park where we'd first pieced together what was happening, except now the weight of it all was different, heavier and lighter at the same time. Coach Reeves had officially been fired and was facing criminal charges in 3 states. The lawsuits from former players were piling up. His name had become synonymous with abuse in coaching circles, a cautionary tale about what happens when winning becomes more important than well-being. But we couldn't celebrate any of it. We'd all been complicit in Graham's suffering. We'd all stayed silent when speaking up might have saved him. The list Patricia Dorsey wrote was accurate. We did deserve to face consequences for what we'd allowed to happen, just not the kind of consequences she'd originally planned. Jalen suggested we do something to try to make it right, not for ourselves, but for the kids who'd come after us. We started a peer support group for student athletes, a place where they could talk about pressure and abuse without fear of being dismissed or punished. We partnered with the school counselors to create an anonymous reporting system that actually worked. We raised money for Graham's therapy costs, which his family had been struggling to cover. It wasn't enough. Nothing we did could undo the damage that had already been done, but it was something. Senior year ended with a graduation ceremony that felt surreal after everything that had happened. I walked across that stage and shook hands with the interim principal and threw my cap in the air with everyone else, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept thinking about Graham, about Coach Reeves, about all the kids in all the schools who were going through the same thing right now without anyone to help them. I kept thinking about Patricia Dorsey, a mother so desperate to be heard that she'd threatened 12 teenagers just to get someone to pay attention. I kept thinking about Mr. Okonkwo, the janitor who'd changed everything by being observant enough to look twice at a crumpled piece of paper. The local newspaper ran a profile on him a few weeks before graduation. It turned out he'd been advocating for better mental health resources at the school for years, writing letters to the administration that went unanswered. He'd seen troubled kids come and go. He'd watched the warning signs that nobody else seemed to notice, and he'd kept trying to get someone to listen, even when no one did. He was retiring at the end of the year after 23 years of service. The school board gave him a plaque and a cake. The students who knew what he'd done gave him something more meaningful. We made sure his letters finally got read. The criminal trial against Coach Reeves started that fall and lasted 3 weeks. 19 former players testified about their experiences, including Graham himself, who flew in from the West Coast where he was studying music therapy at a small liberal arts college. I watched from the gallery as he took the stand and described in clinical detail what Reeves had done to him. The isolation tactics, the public humiliation, the private threats that made him believe his life would be over if he ever spoke up. His voice didn't shake once. His mother sat in the front row crying silently, and I realized she was seeing her son whole again, for the first time in years. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 12 counts of child abuse and 4 counts of reckless endangerment. Reeves was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 4. It wasn't enough time for the damage he'd caused, but it was something. It was accountability. It was proof that these things didn't have to stay hidden forever. The school district settled the civil lawsuits for an undisclosed amount and agreed to implement every recommendation from the independent review. They established an endowment fund for student mental health services named after the 3 kids from Reeves's previous schools who never recovered from what he did to them. One had taken his own life at 19. 2 others were still in treatment facilities. Their names were read aloud at the dedication ceremony, and for the first time, I understood that the list Patricia wrote wasn't really about the 12 of us. It was about all the kids who came before, whose suffering had been ignored and forgotten, whose pain had accumulated silently until one mother couldn't take it anymore. 4 years later, I'm finishing up my degree in sports psychology. I want to work with young athletes who've been through what Graham went through, what so many kids go through in programs where winning matters more than people. The scars from that week in senior year have never fully healed. I still have moments of paranoia. Still check over my shoulder sometimes when I walk through gyms or locker rooms. Still feel guilty when I think about what I could have done differently years ago. But I also know now that guilt without action is worthless. Graham taught me that. Patricia taught me that. Mr. Okonkwo taught me that. Sometimes it takes something terrifying to wake people up to the truth that's been right in front of them all along. I got a letter from Graham last month, the first direct communication between us since that conversation in his grandmother's living room. He's doing well, working at a youth center teaching music to kids who've been through trauma, building something good from the wreckage of what he survived. He said he'd read about the work I was doing and wanted me to know he was proud of me. He said he'd finally let go of the anger he'd carried for so long. He said he hoped the 12 of us had found peace too. I keep that letter in my desk drawer and read it sometimes when the guilt gets heavy. The 12 names on that list are scattered across the country now, living different lives, carrying different versions of the same story. We stay in touch through a group chat that's mostly just memes and sports updates these days, but every year on the anniversary we check in with each other. We share what we've done in the past 12 months to be better than we were. We remind each other that we got a second chance that a lot of people don't get, and we make sure we're not wasting it. Because somewhere out there, a janitor is picking through trash cans, a mother is crying herself to sleep, and a kid is sitting in a locker room wondering if anyone will ever believe what's being done to him.